All right, there they are. Hi, Worldview Seminar, folks. So we're finally to our last week of class here, starting April 17th, which is topic for the day. Even though I'm recording this on Thursday evening, so when you see this, it'll most likely be tomorrow, which is Friday the 17th. Then we've just got 1 week left. So sometime either tomorrow or Saturday, kind of depends. I will be posting the study guide for the final so that you guys can have access to that. So, be prepping for that. I will issue a basic explanation of how that final exam will work and how you'll be taking it and submitting it, but I'm not going to go through that right now. So I will obviously provide you with further details that are written down for you and posted on Converge, and we'll make sure that you're all on the same page. So that's coming soon, and remember that we've just got one last film group, and that each individual in that group is going to be submitting their video, so that will be happening next week. And the last group 8, is going on postmodernism, and the postmodernism film that they were assigned is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So I guess we'll end on something that probably will make many of us chuckle, and I'll look forward to those video submissions. And that also means that that is moving into next week. We have just one more video category, one more movie category. So there are 7 films in that category. So make sure that you've done all 4 of your film and philosophy submissions to me, and I will take it from there. I think most of you have done that, but I have a few that are lagging. So just make sure you get that work to me. And then, of course, a week from today, so Friday, April 24th, we will be spending time going through Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. So you need to have completed the novel, and most of you need to have typed out your responses to the questions regarding Brave New World, and those need to be submitted on Friday the 24th. So we're getting pretty close. Not a whole lot left to do by comparison anyway, but of course this is always one of the busy times of the semester, and it's even more hectic given our present circumstances. So please hang tough. You guys are almost there. Believe me, I'm certainly feeling it too. So it's been quite an adjustment. I hope you appreciate. So today we decided it's such a weird existence we're having here. I almost felt like I needed to reconnect with being a professional. So I put on a sport coat and a tie, and I think my cat almost fainted when she saw me. It's such a surreal vision for her right now when I'm not in my shorts and t-shirts and ball caps or whatever. So anyway, so that's the reason. I just thought it'd be kind of nice to look a little bit more professional for you on an occasional setting here. So I may put on a tie again before the end, but we'll see. All right, guys, gals, let's go back through and just reconnect for a minute. Remember that as we deal with the worldview analysis grid, that no matter which worldview we've been discussing, that this basic component of creation, fall, and redemption, that this is our foundation point, that these are the kinds of questions that all people ask when it comes to ultimate questions, ultimate reality. So although the temptation is always to just think of worldview, so creation, fall, redemption, to think of these elements through only the lens of a Christian perspective, just draw back to something that we talked about a couple months ago, where I just stressed the point that all people ask these questions, and these are perfect ways to frame the issues that are being addressed, regardless of which starting point or which expectation the individual may have. So every worldview has has to begin, as the slide says, has to begin with questions of origins. Where did it all come from, and why are we here, and or who are we, and how did we get here? The fall, what's wrong? You know, why did everything go down the toilet, and why is humanity, why is the world suffering so much, and why is there so much, you know, conflict and war and pestilence and all the rest? And then of course there is always this question of, well, if given the scenarios that we're living in, given these realities, what can we do about it, essentially? Can there be anything done? And if so, what might those things actually entail? So just a real quick reminder, a very basic one, but I think a really critical one. Okay, now going back to something we were talking about, the secular humanist view. I hope that you have had time at this point, and if you have not had time, please make time to go and read through the Patheos piece on secular humanism and to take a look at the links that I've already provided for you. I think they are very helpful. So I've been reading some submissions about, you know, film. So the film reviews regarding secular humanism, and some of you actually locked in pretty well. And yet I think others were a little bit confused about how and why certain films might connect with the secular humanist perspective. And so I want to spend a little more time. I want to dip into a couple more films here today, but I hope that the points that I made the other day regarding the film Troy, that was helpful for you. I think that is one good place for us to start as far as the secular humanism is concerned, and particularly with the film Interstellar, which is so thoroughly secular humanist. Once you realize that and watch Interstellar through that secular humanist framework, actually that whole philosophy really kind of slaps you in the face. Even though I would say that with many of the films that you guys were assigned, of course, I talked to you from the beginning about the fact that there will be, you know, some other worldviews that often, you know, rear their heads and reveal themselves a little bit here and there, and that is true. But, and that certainly, by the way, that's very true with The Life of Pi, although for The Life of Pi, the secular humanist grounding is actually critical, even though there are other worldviews that come into the fray and are part of the story at some level. Really, when we back it out and we look at the nature of the protagonist in the film and how he sees himself in the world, that secular humanist framework is really the foundation. It's really the core. There are some other considerations with the worldviews that surround him, and they infiltrate the story, but they are not really the foundation. So I'm just going to mention a couple other films here that I think will help you connect and maybe spot how secular humanism exists in some of the pop culture elements, particularly in this case with movies, because that's what you guys have been doing. So the first one I want to mention is, for today anyway, is a film that I really value. I mean, it's a film that I come back to again and again. It's one of the great drama pieces of the early 21st century. It's a film by Robert Zemeckis, one of the great directors. So Zemeckis directed back in 1985. He did Back to the Future, right? So great Robert Zemeckis film that most of you are probably aware of. And he's done a lot of interesting work. In fact, some of his more recent work is more grounded in a Judeo-Christian worldview perspective. And so I want to acknowledge that. But one film that I think is actually very thoroughly grounded in a secular humanist perspective is a marvelous and moving, emotionally driven film called Castaway, with Tom Hanks yet again. I mean, it's kind of weird sometimes, if I'm honest, that Tom Hanks is in just about, he's in so many movies, and most of his movies that he has played roles in have been pretty fantastic films. We actually just watched his recent turn as Fred Rogers in A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, and I was very impressed with his portrayal of the the great Mr. Rogers. the late Mr. Rogers. I wish he was still around. So Tom Hanks is playing the protagonist in the film by the name of Chuck Noland, and Helen Hunt is his love interest in the film, and there's a great bond and connection to them. And of course, the Chuck Noland character, we find he's working for FedEx, and he's all about being on time and all the rest. And there's great irony in that. When his FedEx transport plane goes down in the Pacific Ocean, and Chuck Noland finds himself in probably the most surreal circumstance that anyone could ever think of, and that is marooned on this small tropical island in the Pacific. And we are right there witnessing the trauma of the event and the slow realizations that wash over Chuck Noland as he is marooned on this island by himself. And he begins to adjust to what he suspects will be his new life, and maybe his life until he actually dies. And we're certainly led to believe that that is the likelihood, if not the certainty, for Chuck Noland. And given the remoteness of the island and the fact that the air traffic control systems had lost track of their aircraft as it was going down, and he's the lone survivor of that aircraft. And so we really feel for Chuck Noland, and we have an almost immediate connection to him because of the peril that he has lived through. And even the ways in which Zemeckis and his production crew and the screenwriters, the way that they have written the film, it is thoroughly grounded in what is experienced and what is measured, what can be seen and what can be touched and what can be heard. And so Chuck Noland's entire experience as he's marooned on this island, it comes through a very humanist lens. Chuck Noland is not marooned, and he's not marooned and then makes the decision that he will pray for deliverance. He is not quoting scripture. He is not kneeling and praying to any deity of any kind. It doesn't appear to enter the landscape at all. Everything that has happened to Chuck is either cast through the lens of, a Darwinian naturalist framework or a very materialist humanist framework. And it's still a powerful film. Again, as I should always remind you, I don't want you guys to be averse to watching these films. I don't want you to avoid them. I think you should watch them, and I think films like Castaway are powerful in their own right. And I really do enjoy and will continue to watch this film because I love it. But this secular humanist framework, life must be merely viewed through the lens of rationalism, through the lens of logic, through the lens of what you can actually do about your own circumstances. You yourself as a human being, you are in charge of your own circumstances and your own present and your own future. Nothing else determines that for you. You've got to use your mind, and that's it. Now, of course, Christian humanists would say, well, yes, there's an element of truth to that. So I'm a Christian humanist. I value the life of the mind. I think survival skills are actually pretty important, and they have merit, and that is very true. So if I'm ever stranded on an island somewhere, or if I'm ever in a difficult circumstance like that, I fully intend to use my human competence. But I would also remind you that as a Christian, I would certainly engage in supplication to the Almighty, and I would be praying very, very, very constantly, very consistently about God as He oversees my life and whatever plight I found myself in. But that is certainly not in play here. And the secular humanist component does come to fruition in a couple of different ways, but I think most thoroughly and most obviously in a very moving but thoroughly secular humanist speech that Chuck Noland gives at the tail end of the film, once he's returned to civilization and he's sitting with his friend at night after encountering his love interest, Kelly, played by Helen Hunt. and he talks about his experience on the island and how there was nothing he didn't think there was anything he was going to be able to do to escape. And so it was about him, his humanity, that physical reality that he found himself in. Logic, he was depending on logic to frame his reality, logic alone, rationality. And then he talks about the fact that, either by, sheer luck, really, sheer luck provided him with a sail that he was able to then, of course, with his human ingenuity, he was able to use that sail to then save himself from the situation he found himself in, right? So very similar to the interstellar component, the secular humanist, we don't depend on any higher power, some sort of metaphysical reality. We depend on just the physical realities that we know, what we can identify and measure. And that is definitely in play with Castaway too, as Chuck Nolan saves himself. He's provided, whether we want to talk about random chaotic chance or whatever, he's provided with the piece of the portable toilet that washes up and that he ultimately fastens to his raft and uses as a sail. And that enables him to self-rescue, you might say. And really this is the framing. Now there are some ethereal connections throughout the film, like the image on the package that he ultimately, goes and seeks out, the woman in Texas with the wings, right? So there may be some interesting connections in that regard, but I don't think that removes us from the foundation of secular humanism. And I love that the worldview writer Brian Godawa digs into this, and some of these points are really where he focuses his energy when it comes to the film Castaway. So that's the first film. And the second film is one that I know a lot of young men at Corbin and young men across America have watched quite a bit over the years, and it's not necessarily a horrible film, although I question some of its merit. The film is titled 300. It's by the director Zack Snyder, and it is his kind of comic book, graphic comic take, if you will, on the legend of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. And it's certainly a very interesting set piece. There's a lot of visual innovation that goes into the film, and Snyder and his crew deserve some credit for that. Narratively, it's a big old mess, by the way, and just some of the creatures that populate the movie are just so surreal. Some of the scenes overall it kind of escapes me as to why they were framed the ways in which they were. But more than anything for us here and now is the 300 is another film similar to Troy in this sense, where there's an interesting comparison being made, and that comparison is essentially that the light of the world in this story is the Greek world that ostensibly, anyway, right? Their mythology, their pantheon of gods. The right-thinking Greeks know that that's just a bunch of crud and that's just fantasy. The right-thinking Greeks associate themselves again with what can be seen and understood, what is logical, what is framed through rationality with the human mind. And the Spartans and their fellow Greeks, they represent that orientation, the light of the world, as opposed to the counterparts in the film, of course, the Persians, led by Xerxes, who, by the way, is referenced for us in the Old Testament, and a very important part of the Old Testament, in fact. And so in this retelling, this refashioning by Zack Snyder, of course, the religious dogmatists in the film are cast as zealots, as overseeing oppression, and as being actually the instigators of oppression. So Xerxes himself, his Persian army, there's this religious devotion element that they exist to be a part of. There's an earlier point in the film, and actually that's the clip that I posted for you guys, the part where Leonidas meets Xerxes in this very strange, dialogue, this very strange conversation. Earlier in the film, in a part that I couldn't post because there's a very sexualized content, Leonidas goes to seek the advice from the ephors, these council members. And the ephors, by the way, those were really an actual part of Spartan society, but they were just older members of Spartan society, old men from Spartan society who actually paid homage to their religious belief system and a group of religious prophets, in essence, that gave them advice about Spartan culture. Well, in the film, of course, Leonidas goes and he talks to the ephors, and these ephors are presented as these dehumanized and very ugly, horrible beasts who look for the sacrifice of virgins before they can make their predictions, and they couch everything through the lens of their religious belief system. And you are meant, obviously, because of the way they are presented and how they are designed and presented as corrupt beings, that all of that is bad. It's a very subtle, perhaps, but a very clever set piece put in play that is at least at some intentional and very real level, it's promoting the notion of secular humanism. So interesting film, maybe. I certainly wouldn't call it a great film, but I would say that because it has garnered so much of a following in American culture, it is certainly a cult film, is probably the way I would put it. I wanted to include it on the list because I think it deserves to be watched carefully, and identifying these worldviews is important. And then the last one that I put up for you guys is Amadeus, and the clip that I linked for you is Amadeus, and this one's kind of a reverse in a sense. And what I mean by that is it is actually there is a morality play that is done in Amadeus, and so there is very very much this this effort to critique a secular humanist perspective. And what I mean by that is the key narrator in Amadeus is Salieri. And although Salieri in the film differs in some really important ways from the actual Salieri figure, in the film, Salieri is a hypocrite, first and foremost, because he claims that he wants to live his life in service to the Lord, and he wants to use his compositions, his musical compositions, to glorify God. And so he's a two-faced jerk, really, because he says that's his rhetoric. He tells anyone who's willing to listen, really, as he's walking through the narrative, that's his ostensible goal. But we understand very quickly that he's thoroughly, first and foremost, he's thoroughly jealous of Mozart. Secondly, we find that Salieri is indeed hypocritical. He has very little desire, at least a very limited desire, to genuinely glorify God. What he wants to do is glorify himself through his own power, through the power of his own creation. And what we see is that his very, very humanist perspective, his secular humanist take, is a corrupting one. And he undermines himself through the pursuits of his life. So much so that he ultimately goes crazy, right? He goes insane, and we learn that through the narration of the film. And one of the things that he just can't seem to handle, as he's speaking all of his hypocritical lies about his desire to serve God, the thing that we realize is that Salieri just can't handle that God, in all of his omnipotence, right, in all of his omniscience, that God actually allowed such a beautiful musical gift to be housed in a pagan like Mozart. Now, Mozart understood Christianity, and Mozart may have paid lip service to it himself at some level. But yeah, Mozart did not live his life, his actual life, in devotion to Christ. Even though he dealt with, in a lot of his music, he dealt with, the tropes of Christianity. Mozart himself was a hedonist, and some regarded him as thoroughly pagan, those who knew him in his own lifetime. I don't know if that observation is entirely secure and true, but it is the perspective that is brought to the forefront in the movie. And so in a very real, very powerful way, we're able to see how a secular humanist, someone who believes that they oversee the course of their own life, that they will determine it themselves, and that they will either succeed or fail based on their own capacities and their own designs and their own, I guess we'll call them their own machinations, right? So that's the Salieri character, and he is a thoroughly tragic one. There's no one to blame but himself in the end for how his, living life under his own power for his own reasons, as he designs it, based on his own reasoning and his own logic and his own conclusions. That life is the life that backfires completely on Salieri. And Brian Gatto, in the book that I use for my film class, walks the reader through this in some detail, and he's absolutely right. It's a thoroughly secular humanist take, and we see from this flipped perspective, we see that there is a really interesting critique to offer. So I told you guys maybe 2 months ago or more now that when we got to the last couple of film categories, so for monism, New Age pantheism, for secular humanism, and then ultimately for postmodernism, that those would be the hardest, and they are. I wanted the worldviews represented in these films to be a little more subtle. I wanted to force students to dig into them a little more, because they're not going to slap you in the face quite as much as something like, the Marxist worldview in A Bug's Life or Monsters, Inc. I mean, if you missed that after going through our worldview study, then that means that maybe the drug use in your life needs to stop. I don't know, but obviously with those films, it's much clearer, much easier to connect. These requires a little more thought as you think about what is being represented by the characters. So I hope this has been helpful. I think it's really interesting films, really great films in some cases, like Castaway, I think is a phenomenal film. But certainly films that couch things very specifically and very purposefully through these worldview lenses. Okay, that's going to take us to Monday the 20th, and we will be dipping into postmodernism. But I remind you, as I said earlier, please be looking for the study guide, which I will post either tomorrow afternoon or Saturday. I haven't figured out the time frame quite yet, but you'll have that study guide here in the next day or so, and you can begin to use it. So, all right, guys, gals, I hope you're doing really well, and I will probably be interacting with many of you vis-a-vis email, but I will also be submitting a couple more of these Zoom lectures before we're all done. So I hope you have a really good rest of your day, and we will connect soon, I hope. Take care.